Hi to everyone out there. We're going live a minute early. We're just discussing such deep subjects as the weather and our worst nightmares of crimes against books. But this is the New York Ghost Story Festival, and we'll be back in just a second to introduce it to you. But first, our opening. Okay, we're back. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the New York Ghost Story Festival. When the year grows old and December's daylight departs too soon, it is time to fill the dark nights with stories of the ghosts and the supernatural. Welcome to our second year. I'm your host, Daniel Braum, author of the book Underworld Dreams. I'm here with Gwendolyn Kiste, Venita Coehlo, Jon Padgett, and Steve Rasnic Tem. I'll introduce them, and hi everyone. I'll introduce them and get to the discussion and the stories in just a bit. I just want to introduce the festival, and I'm going to start it off by reading a small bit of a ghost story. The New York Ghost Story Festival is an annual event of ghost story readings and discussion that was founded last year with the intent of bringing together authors of the uncanny, the strange, and the fantastic from New York and around the world to celebrate and examine the ghost story in all of its forms. You're watching on the YouTube channel, Daniel Braum. Please subscribe, stay in touch, and also watch the full festival, which this year is going to be 5 nights. The next night is Saturday, December 11th, followed by Tuesday the 14th, Friday the 17th, and Saturday the 18th. On the 11th, we'll have Jeffrey Ford, Kathy Kojan, Brian Evanson. On the 14th, we'll have Brenda Tolman, David Surface, Pat Wheel, and Joshua Rex. On the 17th, we'll have Rudy Dorneman, Eric Weijnard, Joe Kaplan, and Kevin Lucia. And the final night, the 18th, we'll have Angela Slatter, Sarah Langan, John Langan, and Kevin Brockman. Before I introduce tonight's guests, I'm going to open the festival by reading a bit from Kevin Brockmeyer's book, which is called The Ghost Variations. Oops. And this book came out in February of this year, and it features 100 really short ghost stories. It covers the wide range of what ghosts are and can be. And I thought it was a great way to kick off the festival, this very, very short bit. So this one is called A Notable Social Event. The ghost in the law firm's doorway never stops leaving. Every few seconds, she glides across the threshold of the exit, steps suddenly to her left, raises the back of her right hand to her cheek, and starts over, her face bearing a sunken look of hard concentration. She does not return to the spot where she began exactly. She recurs there. Her irises are white with death, her skin silver, her hair a gray-green Spanish moss. 107 years ago, in this very hall, when the law firm's warren of desks and tables was a ballroom with red oak parquetry and a hammered tin ceiling, the young physician, on whose attention she had set her heart, had spurned her for the linoner's daughter, putting his lips to her plump pink knuckles and declaring his infatuation before the entire room. Back then, The ghost was only a living girl of 15. Though she tried to leave furtively at the doorway, she stumbled into someone's manservant, a tall oak post of a fellow who punctured the silence between waltzes with, "I do beg your pardon, miss," and then, seeing the tears on her cheeks, "Are you not well?" The girl lifted her hand to her face in a spasm of embarrassment, then ran off into the square. Now she repeats the same maneuver again and again, but with a million minor variations, raising or lowering her elbow, rotating her ankle a quarter inch to the right, pivoting her waist to move the bustle of her gown. She flees through the door, then flees through the door again. She brings her hand to her cheek, this time as if to fend off a blow, the next as if to swat at an insect, the next as if to test for a fever. She separates her fingers slightly. She adjusts the angle of her wrist. It is not for shame that she haunts these few square feet of the law office, but for the inadequacy of the original gesture. At 15, she thinks she failed to express the true complexity of her emotions. All her humiliation, resentment, forlornness, and heartache, each feeling in its exact proportions, and so, ever since she died, she has performed her flight from the ballroom with countless tiny re-inflections. She is like a singer who cannot stop trying to perfect a particular syllable. When she was alive, she spoke the moment. In truth, she mumbled it, and now she is trying to sing it. Sometimes in the long hours of a summer afternoon, when the paralegals at their desks are seeking a distraction, they watch the ghost emerging from her pleat in space and time and wonder if their lives will slip by like hers did, leaving them fastened so hopelessly, so desperately to the past, as if a life could work any other way, as if that wasn't precisely what a life must do. So we'll start off the festival with that. That was from the Ghost Variations. Kevin Brockmeyer will be with us in the last night. On to tonight's guests. How's everyone? I'm hearing some echo on my end, so I'm not sure if our guests can't figure out who it is. If people are able to use headphones, that might help, but we'll just keep moving forward here. I'm going to be opening and closing the discussion tonight with a question to the entire panel, and in between, I'll have questions that will go directly to each author, and right in the middle, we'll take a 5-minute break right around the 1 hour mark. Our first guest, Venita Coehlo, lives in Goa, India, and writes across books, film, and television, and she has 10 published books to her credit and is also an established screenwriter. She's won several awards and has recently been honored with India's highest accolade, the Sahitya Academy Award from India's Academy of Letters. She is currently busy with a book and 2 web series. When not writing, she travels across India in her caravan with her daughter. Please welcome Venita Coehlo. Welcome, Venita. It's great to have you here. How are you today?
I'm good. I'm very good this morning in India.
That's great. What you mentioned in your biography, you do a lot of traveling. Where have your travels taken you to most recently? And do you hear any ghost stories along the way?
Well, most recently, I've been down to South India, and India is absolutely covered with ghosts. Wherever you go, they have their local variation. So you get to hear a lot of ghost stories in India, just
Oh,
hundreds. We've got different names for ghosts. I mean, I've got a little notebook that has dozens of names of ghosts because each region has its own variety.
wow. This is music to my ears. Notebooks and places full of all the variations of ghosts. And we're going to be hearing some of your stories not too far into the show. I also want to introduce our next guest, Gwendolyn Kiste. I want to welcome her back to the festival. She's the Bram Stoker Award-winning author of The Rust Maidens, Bones Set in Feathers, and Her Smile Will Untether the Universe, Pretty Marys All in a Row, The Invention of Ghosts, and the forthcoming Reluctant Immortals. Her short fiction and nonfiction have appeared in Nightmare Magazine, Best American Science Fiction and Fantasy, Asterion, Tours Nightfire, Black Static, The Dark, Daily Science Fiction, Interzone, Lamplight, and Others. Originally from Ohio, she now resides in an abandoned horse farm outside of Pittsburgh with her husband, 2 cats, and not nearly enough ghosts. The pre-order is up now for her upcoming novel, Reluctant Immortals, which is coming from Saga Press in 2022. Gwendolyn, your biography, first of all, welcome. It's great to have you back. In your biography, it says not nearly enough ghosts. Is my logic faulty? Does that mean there are no ghosts or just some ghosts and not nearly enough ghosts?
I'm not sure there's any ghosts. Like, I don't think there's any ghosts, but I've always got my fingers crossed, so I don't want to be like, there's no ghosts, because maybe there's a few, and I just haven't met them yet. But I don't think there's any. I'm disappointed.
Ghostly optimism at its finest. We'll take it. Also want to welcome back Jon Padgett. He was also a guest at the Nighttime Logic series this summer. The Strange, Weird, and Uncanny reading series. Jon is a professional, though lapsed ventriloquist who lives in New Orleans, and I believe it because he was just showing us one of his books in the backstage area. He's the editor-in-chief of Grim Scribe Press, which publishes Visterion, a literary journal, which is a source of critical study and creative response to the work of Thomas Ligotti. Jon Padgett's first short story collection, The Secret of Ventriloquism, was named the best fiction book of the year by Rue Moore magazine. It's great to have you back too, Jon. Jon, you live in New Orleans. What you told us is warm and balmy today. It's a city known for a lot of things. Is there anything about living in New Orleans that is conducive to you for stories of the ghosts and the supernatural?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I grew up about 200 miles east of here in Mobile, Alabama. And New Orleans has always been a place that I have periodically come to throughout my childhood, my teenage years, my young adulthood, and finally moving here over 20 years ago. It is like no other city in the world that I've been in, and it's the only city in the world that I have ever felt home in. And one of the reasons why is because of its incredibly saturated atmosphere, a city kind of haunting itself.
I believe it to be true. I didn't believe all the hype about New Orleans until I visited there for the first time, and then as soon as I was there, I knew, even just as a visitor, I knew that everything, the reputation was true. I want to give a warm welcome also to our next guest, Steve Rasnic Tem. Steve is a past winner of the Bram Stoker World Fantasy and British Fantasy Awards. He has published over 475 short stories. Recent collections include The Night Doctor and Other Tales from Centipede and Thanatrama Stories, that's from Valancourt. His novel Ubo is a dark science fictional tale about violence and its origins, featuring such viewpoint characters as Jack the Ripper and Stalin. Yours to Tell, Dialogues on the Art and Practice of Writing, written with his late wife Melanie, is available from Apex Books. His new collection is Thanatrama Stories from Valancourt Books. The Publisher's Weekly Start Review says, World Fantasy Award winner Tim is at his sharpest and most crushing in this collection, and it's essential for fans of dark speculative fiction. Thank you for being here with us, Steve. Welcome. You've written so many short stories, and many of them are ghost stories. What is it about the short story form for you that lends itself to the ghost story or the supernatural tale?
Well, it's short. So you have that. Pope talked about that unity of effect. You have that in the short story, and I also think it becomes more difficult to sustain supernatural in a story the longer it is. With the short story, you can magnify small moments. And small moments, I think, is where the ghost story is most vital. Just slight variations in the norm. I also think that the ghost story rises or falls based on how good the realistic aspects of the tale are presented. In fact, I think that's true of horror stories in general. I think tales of the fantastic, when they fail, they usually don't fail because of a lack of imagination or in the fantastic elements. They fail on the level of just things like characterization or description, portraying something so realistically you're able to believe it.
Yeah, I think it's a wonderful observation, and perhaps a deceptively simple. It's both so simple and yet yet so expert observation. I first heard something like that. I'm a big fan of Robert Aikman, and I heard once at a convention Peter Straub talking about just why, like how do these stories work, and one of the elements that he did speak about was the verisimilitude of just the voice, of just the way Aikman was presenting the mundane, or just the roteness of his view of Britain, was what enabled that grounding for the ambiguous and the fantastic, the ghosts or whatever in Aikman's work to come to life. And as you said, I think that's true if you think about it. It seems like it's really true analysis for ghost stories or for short stories in general. We're going to get to the first question for the panel, but Steve has allowed me to read something that he wrote back in about 1990. We were talking before about how some of we panelists were feeling old, but wow, I don't even want how long ago was 1990 if I want to feel old here. But Steve had done a post. He did a post on Facebook when we first communicated about this and his thoughts on the ghost story. So the first little bit is from Steve's post, and then this is an introduction he wrote to one of his books of stories back in 1990. Thoughts on the ghost story. In 1991, I, Steve, wrote this little collection of ghost stories, Absences, Charlie Good's Ghosts. It was for Rosemary Pardo's Haunted Library in the UK, the contents of which are now available in his ebook collection, Absent Company. In writing the stories, it struck me how so often the strongest presences in our lives is actually an absence, an idea of which has informed many of my tales ever since. So here's the introduction to that collection. Hauntings, Power of the Past. Of all the supernatural creatures that inhabit my fiction, the ghost is the only one of which I've been asked, do you believe in such things? In part, this may be because the ghost is the most accessible, the most familiar motif of supernatural fiction, the figure whose factual existence the average person is most likely to accept. Those who scoff at the very idea of vampires and werewolves may very well believe wholeheartedly in the reality of ghosts. I never know exactly how to answer such a question. As with any of the things I write about, my temptation is to say literally no. I could go on to explain that most of the so-called true-life accounts of ghostly encounters seem far too ordinary to me, couched in the terms and reflective of the desires and needs of the living. I could go on to say that I suspect that if there are in fact ghosts, their reality must be far more extraordinary than these accounts suggest. But I seldom bother because I find that sort of issue irrelevant to my own work, at least in my terms of writing. I have only the most passing interest in a literal world. What I choose not to talk about, however, is how one of the most vivid smells of my life is the sweetness of the hair of a child now dead, or how some of the most distinctive voices in my head are ones I've not heard in years, or even how the old Victorian house I now own can never seem completely my own. It is too unmistakably an accumulation of destinies altered and lives completed over the last 100 years. I see evidence of this in every room. Every repair job, every small bit of remodeling entails a journey into the past and into other people's lives. Although we are continually admonished to live in the now and told that to do otherwise exposes us to everything from neuroses to cancer, most of us find it impossible to comply. When reading Wordsworth's lines that the world is too much with us, I'm often tempted to substitute past for world. Indeed, for many of us, the past is the bulk of our world. For an unfortunate few, it is the only world they will ever know. It has power beyond reckoning. It petrifies the living and enlivens the dead. This kind of continual backward glance is not something I would ever advocate. We should never permit the past to cloud and obscure what is breathing and growing around us. But I also believe that there is knowledge and discovery in the power of the past. In the best ghost stories, the awe engendered should be as profound as the terror. A close study of the ghost story teaches us that all the forms of memory are virtually incalculable. Our lives and the lives of all we have loved are recorded in the way a sheet drapes across the bed, in the tattered remains of a poster glued to a fence, and in the shadows cast by a particular arrangement of furniture, in the pattern of freckles on a child's face. At times, it seems impossible to separate these memories from who we are. When we peer into the darkened room and attempt to apprehend all the shadows dwelling there, we seem to be looking into the very heart of ourselves, where each ghostly manifestation is an essential part of us, a significant event in our lives, perhaps even an organ of unknown function. To look at the ghost is to see ourselves and our destinies. And that was from Denver, 1990. So I'll open it up. Thank you for letting me read that, Steve. We'll open discussion up to the panel with just a very simple question. We'll start with you, Steve. What is the appeal of the ghost story, and just what is the ghost story? Is it as simple as a story with a ghost or something supernatural in it, or is there something more going on? We'll take that over to Steve and then to the panel.
Well, I wrote that when I was 40. I just turned 71. So, and it's interesting that for me, I still have the same concerns, in that I believe strongly in living in the now, because if you don't, you miss an awful lot of life. But the older you get, the more difficult that becomes, especially when you reach that point where you have a lot more life behind you than you have ahead of you. For me, the ghost is one of our most essential metaphors for our struggle of living. And our real struggle of living, I think, is knowing how to deal with the past, how to appreciate it and learn from it, at the same time keep it from consuming us. And that becomes really difficult when you become old. At least I found, and a lot of my friends of the same age have found that it's something you have to kind of consciously put aside just to notice what's around you and what's happening. I have a house full of photographs on the walls, which I love, but at the same time, I think maybe there's somewhat of a detriment, because I glance at one and it takes me back somewhere for 15, 20, 30 minutes at a time. And I would forget what I was doing. I was supposed to be going to get my lunch, and somehow it's 2:00 and I'm hungry, and I'm thinking, what was I thinking about? And I think that struggle is perhaps more marked for people who are old. I know I have grandchildren in their 20s, and the one thing I enjoy watching with them is they are so immediate in their present lives and all the exciting things that are happening to them, and they're trying to decide what they're trying to do for the rest of their lives. They're looking for their mates. They're trying to find ways to spend their time, and it's all very, very immediate. And I find that I remember that, and I envy that.
Yeah, I mean the best stories, not only the best science fiction is about the here and now. Maybe the best ghost stories are about the here and now as well. Um, what does the rest of the panel think? What's the appeal and what's the makeup of the ghost story?
I do think I've always thought of it as being something about the past as well. I think that there's a lot about ghosts that are about the past. One of the other things I've often thought, though, is that it's kind of about a little bit about the future, or the hope that we go on in some way. Ghosts are kind of like the continuation, and even if there is a ghost, there's an idea that maybe you can fix it. Because so often ghost stories, at least a lot of the ones I feel like I came across as a kid, were about unfinished business. And like the ghost comes back and they have to fix something. And there's always this like hope I think we have that even though we're so tethered to the past, that maybe we can fix it at the same time. That's why I always like, people always talk about The Great Gatsby. I always consider kind of like a ghost story, because he's like so stuck in the past and he so thinks he can change it, but the past is done and it's over and he's never going to be able to, and he hasn't realized it throughout the book. And that fascinates me. That's one of the things that draws me to the ghost story, is that obsession with the past and nostalgia and how much we can get trapped in it, but then also this hope we have to not be trapped in it and to kind of move forward into the future and fix it somehow, even though it's the past and it's static and we can't do that.
Yeah, that was just in the Brockmeyer story that we opened with. It's sort of a hybrid of both those ideas. The girl, the ghost in the story is just thinking of that in a way and just trying to potentially correct that emotional moment in all those movements. Steve, do you feel like your ghost stories written as a 40-year-old are different than your ghost stories written as a 70-year-old?
Some ways, I mean, it's interesting that when I was in my 40s, I was still writing about old people, and it's always been a kind of obsession. I've always enjoyed the company of older people, and I've always found them fascinating to write about. I think one of the differences, maybe, I think my stories tend to be a bit sadder now than they were then. I think in some ways the stories that I wrote in the 40s were a bit more optimistic. I also think I've learned a lot since then in terms of technique and craft. And I think what I write now is better written than what I wrote in my 40s.
Venita, in the introduction, you gave us a glimpse of an image of ghost stories being everywhere. How do these ghost stories? How do these dovetail with the here and now and the past? All the ghost stories that you are steeped in.
India has a very distinct kind of tradition of ghost storytelling. The ghosts are tied to local customs. They're tied to things that have happened to the ground. So we don't have a generic ghost like you have vampires. We don't have vampires, but we have very localized ghosts. For example, one of the ghosts in Bengal is called a joke, and it's specifically the ghost of a Brahmin child that was killed to guard so that its spirit would guard treasure. Tied. So the ghosts, when you look at them closely in India, they're always tied to something that was traditional, that was really terrible. We have a very different kind of tradition of ghosts here. And to me, whenever I read Western ghost stories, they tend to be about the today. They tend to be about the here and now. But ours aren't that. Ours are always pointing backwards to our history, to our past. We have no modern ghosts, which is why when I sat down to write a collection of ghost stories, I said, I need to invent them since we don't have modern ghosts. So I did a series of stories that are based around the headlines, on things that have happened, drastic things that have happened in today. So for me, that was quite different because we don't do that. We tend to be very tied to traditional and looking to the past.
That was you anticipated my next question. I haven't read all of your work, but the collection of ghost stories that I did read seem to fall into that modern view, and that answers the question as to why the ones that I've read from you gave us not not only the ghost stories, but a glimpse into what I felt was a wonderful look into some modern life and modern concerns that are going on in India. So there's no question there. I guess you answered why at least is that the book Dark Tales, that Dark Tales, the contemporary ghost stories.
Wow.
Yes, Dark Tales, a collection of contemporary ghost stories. Is that the one with the modern ghost stories that you invented? Oh, did I lose?
Wow.
Did we lose?
Okay.
Do we lose connection?
Really sorry, we're having some internet connections here, Daniel. I can't hear you.
Oh, I'm sorry. How about, am I back?
Okay, everyone's back. So sorry.
Are we back?
Yeah, we're back. We're back. It blipped out for a minute and I didn't hear that. Sorry.
I apologize. I think we'll just do a quick test. Sorry about that. Can everyone hear each other?
I can hear everybody.
Okay.
I can hear you.
We're back.
The ghosts. We offended the ghosts of the internet. Yeah. Well, you had anticipated before we were interrupted. Venita had anticipated my question, which was I was wondering the collection of stories that I read of hers. I haven't read all of her stories, but at least her most recent book, Dark Tales. The stories in there did feel they were of the modern is the wrong word. They were of the more in the Western vein of the ghosts that felt contemporary, and they explored, as she was saying, these issues that gave me a window into contemporary India in both what is happening in life and in politics and a lot of things that I just wasn't aware of, and it was fascinating to read, especially using the ghost story as the catalyst. John, what makes a ghost story, what's the appeal of it to you, and what makes it tick for you? Let me get you on. I think you seem to be muted, but you're
Yeah. So, I mean, ghost stories have appealed to me ever since I can remember. But you know, it's funny talking about the present, the past, and the future. You know, as we get older, we all become haunted by our own lives, not only our memories, not only our loved ones who we lose, and sometimes may dream about, but ourselves. You know, one of the interesting things to me about the ghost story is the characters that are going through these events. All have to deal with their own baggage, the compulsive thinking that's going on in their head. You know, there's a great story by Gemma Files called Halloo, which is one of the stories in her recent collection, In That Endlessness Our End. And in it, she says, anger is a ghost. Guilt is a ghost. This confession is a ghost. You are a ghost. You are your own ghost. And that was so powerful to me, because it's true. We haunt ourselves. The voice in all of our heads that's going on all the time is a ghost.
That's a great line. What story is that? And John, your video is sometimes you're getting stuck. Just giving you a heads up on that. What story is that? What Gemma File story is that great line from?
It's called Halloo,
Halloo,
and it can be found in her most recent collection that we recently published, called In That Endlessness Our End. and her work is fantastic and very much concerned with such things. But this is one of the really special stories, I think.
Yeah, I love that notion. And this year it just seems to just be a recurring theme of the ghost stories, or the ghost story that isn't the ghost story, or the story that is not a ghost story, the stories of us. Maybe I'm thinking way too much on it, but I'm like, all stories are ghost stories. Okay, I wanted to now ask the first of our guests some questions about ghost stories for Venita. You've written 3 books of ghost stories. I want to mention and ask something from each of them. You've written Whisper in the Wind, which you call a Goa Gothic, which I love that term. And there it is. And you have Washer of the Dead, a collection of feminist ghost stories. We have that to hold up to. And
don't have a copy.
We don't have one. Okay. And then we got Dark Tales, a collection of contemporary ghost stories. Oh, there it is. 2 out of 3 on the images. Whisper in the Wind was one we were corresponding about. That's particularly intriguing to me. I love stories that are setting centric, and Goa is a setting, at least here in the U.S., that I don't see enough about, and I haven't come across it as much in fiction, being a Westerner here. So it really had my attention when you said it was a Goa Gothic. But it wasn't a place that I thought of, at least on my first glance, about being a Gothic setting. So I was doubly intrigued to learn about that title. What could you tell us about the book and about the setting and about the notion of a Goa Gothic?
So this book is actually set, it's a period piece. It's set in the time that the Portuguese were ruling Goa. And as you can see by the roof, I live in an old Portuguese house. And these are all over Goa. And you see a lot of them ruined, fallen in. And the idea for this book actually came into my head the first time I saw a ruined church, which is very rare to see in Goa because our churches are very well maintained. But there is one. It was absolutely fabulous. All these crumbling, flying buttresses. I was like, wow, that's a Gothic setting. And so the book came out of that, set in Portuguese Goa. And it has its share of ghosts running around. So it's kind of, I've done a bit of a metafiction. It's a young man in search of a story, who then encounters a little girl that he makes a promise to. He says, "I'll help you find your sister," and then he starts to find a story that's far richer than anything he could have written. So I've used that trope, but I've worked with it. And I actually wrote it across a very long monsoon where it was raining nonstop, and we had thunder and we had lightning, and every ingredient was there for me to think up a Gothic.
The perfect Gothic convergence. So you're going to read a little bit. You want to set up what you're going to read from Whisper in the Wind for us, please?
Yes, I will be. Wow, I have just lost the page. Give me 1 second and I will be with you.
Sure thing.
Yeah. Whoa, I'm so sorry about this. I've totally lost the page. The Lonely Bones, 163. Okay. Do you want to ask another question? I'll just quickly find this. I'm really sorry about this.
Oh, no. Yeah, no problem. Did you want me to ask a question to you while you're searching?
No, I mean, just ask another question to anybody else.
Oh, sure. Sure thing.
Sorry.
Sure thing. Setting. What is the panel? Let me unmute the panel. Setting. What is the importance of the setting in the ghost stories? Open to our panel.
I always find it interesting that you can really set a ghost story anywhere. Like there isn't just like one locale. I do love like traditional Gothic or anything that's got those kind of Gothic crumbling ruins, but like you can do it anywhere. And I always find it so interesting when I'll come across a ghost story, whether a movie or TV or in literature. It's somewhere I would never expect that, and it's just there's just so much possibility with it. And like we've been keep saying, like every place is haunted, everyone is haunted. I love that that's the theme of like what we've been talking about. And so it's like, if everyone and everything is haunted, then literally anywhere and any time can be a ghost story.
Yeah. All set on the page, Venita?
Yep, all good.
Okay. Thank you for the. All of us are haunted, and every house is haunted, including our bookmarks. So we're going to turn it over to Venita, who's going to be reading a little.
I'm going to,
In the Wind.
Yeah. I fashioned a hook from a bent coat hanger. A sliver of the bucket was visible in the well like a half moon. I managed to snag the handle, but the movement tilted the bucket so that the last inch filled up. It plummeted to the bottom and the rope unreeled from my hand. Holding my breath, I looped the rope over the pulley and began to draw it in. I was so relieved to have the bucket safe that for a moment, I did not realize there was something more than muddy water in it. A white fish gleamed there. I dipped my hand towards it and it came away holding a long, thin bone. I had learned its name years ago in a heavy tome on biology. I recognized it from a diagram that had been etched on yellowing paper. It was the radius, named for the Latin word for ray, one of two complementary bones found in the human forearm. Whose bones are these that have lain so long in the well, gazing up at the far stars in twilight and deep night, lain deep and quiet in silent water? 5 seasons did the leaves drift off the trees. 5 times did the rain fall down the throat of the well. Still, the bones lay dreaming. What did they dream of, these bones, as they lay in still water? They dreamed of their name. They hummed a song in the water, singing their name. They sang of grass they had once walked on, sun that had shone upon them. Solitary in still water, they crooned a litany of their memories, lest they forget them. In the first year, the water tasted of blood. In the second year, it tasted of corruption. In the third year, it tasted of distant seas and dark tides. In the fourth year, it tasted of leaves and musk. And at last, the water became sweet. All the dross melted off them. The bones lay washed clean. They lay now in sweet water. Whose bones are these that have lain so long in starlight, in still water? What name is it that they hum to themselves? Do they remember? The kitchen floor was awash in water. There was a man in the well who sent up buckets that disgorged silt and slime and dull slivers of bone onto the floor. The pulley groaned and gave a mourning wail with each load. The bones were white and clean. 2 policemen assembled them on an old sheet, slowly fitting together knuckle bones and tibia and phalanges and carpals. The right hand was almost intact, the left hand missing. The long curve of the spine was a broken trail, gapped and incomplete. The left foot was a fracture, a scatter of lines. The ribs were a tarnished cage, breached in a dozen places. Scatters of bones were still being sorted, measured, slotted into place. My eyes were drawn back again and again to the careful assembly. One more time, Sarah was a puzzle to which the pieces must be assembled.
Okay, thank you very much for that bit from Whisper in the Wind. Your other collection of ghost stories, Washer of the Dead, you subtitled A Collection of Feminist Ghost Stories. In what way does that book and the stories in that book bring forward the female experience in general, or the female experience in India?
In India, every morning I would open the paper, and I still do, and there'd be some horrible story that involved a woman. We treat our women in India terribly. We beat them, we rape them, we set them on fire. It was just traumatic to read the paper every single morning. And I wanted to talk about it, but I knew that there was no point doing a feminist rant because nobody would ever read you. So I said, let's do the sneaky thing and use, mainstream genre. Let's use something that people will read. So I built a series of ghost stories around feminine issues and feminine experiences. So every single ghost in that book is a ghost that a woman would recognize, and is a ghost that we are haunted by. So that seemed to work very well. It got a lot of attention as a ghost book, and I hope that while people were scared, they also ended up thinking a little bit about what lay behind the making of those ghosts and how we make them every single day in different ways.
I think that's the best stories are stories that do just that. That it's sneaky. It has to entertain us first. At least I'm one of those people that if I'm entertained, that's the gateway to thinking. And I also like there to be there other layers and depth and something to think about in the stories like that. And that seems like a similar the ghost story book of yours that I'm reading right now, Dark Tales, the contemporary one. What were some of the things on your mind and some of the experiences for the stories that you put in Dark Tales, and how are the ghosts that are found in Dark Tales different from the other ghosts in your ghost stories?
So with Dark Tales, I got ambitious. I wanted to scare the whole of India. I said, okay, let's really scare the pants off everyone. So I said, what scares India? And then I took a look at all the headlines that had us as an entire nation petrified. And one of these was the Nirbhaya case. It was a case of a young girl who was raped on a moving bus in Delhi, and brutally raped. And she hung on for many days and fought and finally died. And as a woman in India, I can tell you that every woman I knew was terrified while that entire story was unfolding. There was the Uphar cinema case where a cinema hall caught fire and all the emergency exits had been blocked. They'd actually been doing repair work and they'd cemented them shut, and over 252 people burnt to death in a hall. So every time I go to see a movie in India, I'm checking out the emergency exits, make sure that they're not blocked. There was the case, the Nithari case, where they discovered that this very rich, very, very rich Delhiite in the basement of his fancy building, when they dug up the floor, there were the bones of dozens of children. He'd been taking them from the poor village next door, and because they were poor people's children, the police had refused to write down cases. They'd refused to investigate. And, they stopped counting at 42. So, these horrific things happen here. So to me, I thought, let's take these, because I think these are also things that people need to think about, that we allow this to happen. That, the poor have no voice, they're voiceless, that women have so little power, that, overnight something can happen to you and nobody can help. So I took all of my anger and rage with that, and I took these backdrops and then I slipped in a layer of the supernatural. So that, again, I'm doing exactly that. The supernatural makes you sit down and read it because it's entertaining. But there's a lot more going on, and I hope that I'm not just scaring India, but I'm also making them think a bit about the stuff that we do, the stuff that people get away with here.
Yeah, and the stories are both thought-provoking and absolutely enjoyable ghost stories. Are you going to read a bit from us from one from Dark Tales, Devdas?
Yes.
Okay, I'll send it back to Venita to set up the story.
So Devdas is the name we use in India for someone who's a loser in love. He's a Devdas. And this is actually set against the backdrop of the bombings in Mumbai. I mean, several of our cities have had terrorist bombings, so this is against one of those. And I will let the story do the rest of the talking. Steady, steady, said Aleph. He was sweating even though the fan was going at full speed. Bay's hands were steady as he lowered the fuse. This was the crucial part. A slip and it could be the end of them. The only sound in the rooms was the steady hum of the fan and Aleph's labored breathing. Then came the sound of the door opening. Aleph's head snapped up. Bay froze with his hands a hair from the device. There were 3 locks on that door. No one could open it. A man stepped into the room. His head was down and he looked preoccupied. He paused for a moment and then began to walk towards them. Aleph couldn't believe it. He was heading straight for them. In a panic, he fumbled for his gun. It all happened simultaneously. Bay lowered the fuse into the device. Aleph lifted his trembling hand and pulled the trigger. The explosion of the gunshot was huge in the tiny place. What the fuck, are you nuts? Said Bay, reeling back, hands over his ears. Shit, you crazy bastard. Then he looked up and saw the stranger. He scrambled back from the table. Aleph was staring at the stranger, his eyes wide, his heart thudding. The man hadn't seemed to notice the gunshot. He walked past them to the kitchen. The bullet went through him. Bay stared at the hole the bullet had punched in the plaster opposite. Aleph looked around. The door is closed. He came through it. Bay turned to look at him. What the fuck? What happened? Who is he? I think he's a ghost, whispered Aleph. Bay stared at him in disbelief. Then he tiptoed to the kitchen and peeped in. The man was busy at the kitchen counter. In the light from the window, he was not entirely substantial. The light passed through him, filling him with a soft glow. He was an ordinary-looking man, dressed in a rumpled shirt and pants. He wore spectacles and looked deeply preoccupied. He was intent on his task. What is he doing? Asked Aleph, not daring to look himself. I think he's making himself a cup of tea, said Bay. They both looked at each other, not knowing what to say. The ordinariness of what he was doing helped calm them down. The ghost seemed to have no idea that they were there. He made his tea and then walked into the living room carrying an invisible cup. He fumbled, picking something up, and then began wagging his thumb up and down. What the hell is he doing now? Asked Aleph. Changing channels. Watching TV, said Bay. He was fascinated. Come on, said Aleph. I'm getting out of here. Shh, he does no way here, responded Bay. And if he was going to kill us or whatever, he would have done it by now. He lit a cigarette and sat down to watch the ghost. Are you mad, said Aleph. We can't stay here with the ghost. Bay shrugged and looked at him. We can't leave. It was true. They couldn't leave. They'd found the house a week earlier. It was a nondescript flat in a middle-class colony. They'd rented it for a month, though they never stayed more than 2 weeks in any one place. They'd been moving for a year now. A series of anonymous houses, a series of cities, a series of jobs. Staying anonymous and ahead of the police was not easy. They'd been given a strict set of instructions that covered every eventuality, except, of course, a ghost. Aleph broke protocol and put a call through to Sifr. Sifr was not amused. A ghost? What shit have you boys been smoking? Getting cold feet? Want out of this operation? You know that nobody leaves. You made the vows. And you know what happens. Aleph tried to explain, but Sifr was having none of it. I'll take you down personally if you set a foot out of there. Aleph cut the call and turned to Bay. Bay was still studying the ghost. What do you think happened to him? He died, replied Aleph. What the hell else could it be? I think he offed himself, said Bay. He looks like a loser. Girlfriend must have left him. The ghost sat there in front of a TV set that only he could see. His shoulders were slumped and he exuded sadness. Bloody Devdas, said Bay. The name stuck. Devdas watched TV all evening. Then he went back into the kitchen to make himself dinner. He ate it sitting at the table, a lonely, surreal figure, making all the gestures of a meal with nothing in front of him. When he lay down to sleep, he began to fade until he slowly vanished. That was interesting, said Bay. Aleph had not been able to draw a normal breath the entire evening, but it was just like Bay to forget about fear and become interested in something instead. It felt eerie working at the same kitchen counter where a ghost had stood only a little while ago. Aleph tried to tell himself it was over. The ghost wouldn't come back. But at 7 o'clock the next evening, even though the door remained firmly shut, Devdas stepped through it. It was a pattern that the ghost stuck to firmly. He appeared every evening at about 7 o'clock, walking through the solid door. He seemed to have no idea they were there while he made his dinner, watched TV, and fell asleep. Bay was fascinated from the start. It took a week for Aleph's fear to settle down, but he was always nervous when Devdas appeared. He didn't even like to talk about him, while all Bay did was speculate. I bet that's why the rent was so cheap. The guy offed himself in this room and the landlord didn't tell us. Stop talking about him, said Aleph. How do you think he killed himself, said Bay. I don't know, said Aleph. Doesn't look like he'd hanging himself. Maybe poison, cut his wrists in the bathroom. Will you stop talking about him? Why? He can't hear me, said Bay. Hey, Devdas, how did you die? The ghost was slumped at the table, but he raised his head and then tilted it, listening intently. Hey, he heard me, said Bay. Aleph didn't like it. Leave him alone. Just do the damn work and we can get out of here. They settled into an uneasy sort of coexistence with the ghost. Bay liked to finish all his work before Devdas appeared, so he could spend his time watching him intently. One day, 7 o'clock came and went with no sign of Devdas, and Bay began to worry. He's late today. Wonder what happened to him. Happened to him? He's a ghost. What can happen to him? It was almost 11 when the ghost appeared. He slumped through the door, tiredness in every line. Devdas, said Bay enthusiastically. What happened, man? They make you work late at the office? Huh? Devdas gave no sign of hearing as he walked to the kitchen. A few minutes later, Bay declared triumphantly, he is an accountant. What? asked Alif. Devdas. It's the last week of March when everyone files returns. He's an accountant. He's going to be late every day. Stop it, said Alif. Stop getting so involved with him. Something could happen. Bay only laughed at him. Come on, this is the craziest thing I've ever seen. It's better than television. I love it. Devdas was standing at the window, staring out at the grey vista of peeling buildings. Why do you think he keeps coming back? asked Bay, hanging around doing stupid things like making tea. Maybe he doesn't understand that he's dead. The next day was shopping day. When Alif came back, Devdas was sitting on the sofa and Bay was sitting beside him. What are you doing, asked Alif? Get away from him. Watch this, said Bay. He was holding a paper bag. He blew it up and then slammed it. It exploded with a sharp pop. The ghost started upright and began to look around. Bay began to giggle. Alif didn't think it funny at all. He was petrified. Stop it! If he knows we're here, he might do something. You have to stop it. Reluctantly, Bay got off the sofa. For the rest of the evening, Devdas was restless, prowling around the house, tilting his head to listen again and again. Bay pointed at him. Look at him. He can hear us. We could communicate with him. You want to talk to him? Said Alif. Why? He could tell us, said Bay. What? asked Alif. What it's like being dead on the other side. I mean, they give us all this shit about virgins and eternal happiness, but he knows what it's really like. Let it be, said Alif. I beg of you, just let it be. But Bay wouldn't. He trailed after Devdas, talking to him. What the fuck is it like being dead? Can you tell me that, Devdas? I need to know what is it like being dead. Devdas cocked his head as if he could hear something very faintly. Bay continued to stalk him. Come on, bhai, you can hear me. A look of fear was beginning to grow on Devdas's face. He was definitely hearing something. Stop it, said Alif. Leave him alone. Come on, yelled Bay and slammed his hand on Devdas's shoulder. His hand went right through and hit the sofa that Devdas was sitting on. Devdas sat up, looking around wildly. He had felt it. Alif grabbed Bay and pulled him away from the ghost, saying, Stop it! Bay was screaming manically, Yes, yes, I'm here, Devdas. Alif held him against the wall, too scared of what he would do if he let him go. The ghost, meanwhile, ran to the other room. He came back and began to hurry around the room, grabbing things that they could not see. What's he doing? asked Alif. He's packing. I think he's leaving. Devdas finished his frenzied, invisible packing and ran to the door. He passed through it and was gone. Bay sagged against the wall. He's gone. Maybe he won't come back, said Alif. He'd had enough of living with a ghost and a madman. That night, Bay whistled as he worked. Alif sat nervously beside him, saying, Steady, steady. He sat there watching Bay putting together the wires and the gelatine. They left the bombs and mundane objects, a child's school bag, a tiffin carrier, a box of sweets. He had no idea where they went. Sometimes he would read of a bombing in a paper and wonder if it was one of theirs. He had a feeling that this recent lot had been stockpiled for something special. Devdas was gone for 2 days. He came back on the day they were supposed to leave. Alif had finished packing. Bay had just one IED left to arm. Alif was on his hands and knees, scrubbing the place clean of all evidence of what they'd been doing, when he looked up to see a hand coming through the door. No way, said Bay. Eagerly, the rest of Devdas came through the door. He stood there, looking nervously around. Hey, Devdas, said Bay, we missed you. Don't talk to him, said Alif. Arey bhai, good to have you back, said Bay. He began to follow Devdas around. Devdas was very nervous. He peered around and went carefully from room to room. Bay followed him, asking questions. Can you hear me? You ready to communicate? Devdas didn't seem to hear him as he methodically and carefully searched the whole house. Devdas paused in the bathroom. He bent to wash his hands. Bay leaned over and tapped him on the shoulder. Devdas shot upright. His eyes met Bay's in the mirror and focused. His expression changed to shock. He was actually seeing Bay. Both of them stared at each other for one moment, and then Devdas began screaming. I'm going to leave you hanging there when they both finally see each other.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Hearing you guys hearing my echoing? Oh wow. I'm sorry about that. Okay. Yeah. Well, thank you so much to Venita for reading Devdas from Dark Tales. That was there's so many different moods and things that you put out in that book, but that one was very contemporary. I could see it like a movie when I read it and when you were reading us. So thank you so much. Our next guest is we're going to move on to Steve Rasnic Tem. How are you, Steve?
Oh, pretty good.
Okay. Yeah, I hope I'm hearing some echo, so I hope that you can hear me okay. We've talked a lot about your stories, and you allowed me to read your introduction. Can we start off your selection of the evening with a reading from one of the pair of ghost stories that we're going to be one of your ghost stories that we're going to be talking about? You've picked a pair from your collection, Here with the Shadows.
Sure.
How about which one?
The book.
Go ahead. There it is. It's Here with the Shadows. The two stories that we're going to be talking about are A House by the Ocean and Wheat Field with Crows. Which one you want to give us a little bit of, Steve, first?
I'll start with just a little bit from A House by the Ocean.
Okay, over to Steve.
Lauren found the entrance to the house, a single narrow door that faced the ocean, but it had been placed about a third of the way up the structure, on a porch apparently accessible only by means of several sets of stairs that were staggered across the rocks and appeared to have been constructed from old waterlogged timbers, many with cracked and collapsed surfaces and splintered ends, and decorated with scattered white furry streaks she assumed to be some variety of mold. The whole assemblage appeared unsafe for a child, or anyone else for that matter. She was feeling a familiar, nagging outrage over her sister's irresponsibility before it occurred to her that, of course, Karen couldn't possibly live here. She must have abandoned the ruin ages ago, and for some reason assumed Lauren had her newer address. But then something up on the porch caught her eye, some shape near one corner, almost but not quite out of her line of sight. Rough-formed head and maybe a beak, some sort of huge dark seabird peering down at her, unmoving, patiently waiting. And that led her eyes to the window above and to the right of it, and the face of the little girl on the other side of the glass, looking out. Lauren went up a few steps carefully. The wood was mushy. Moisture was weeping out around her shoes. She took another few steps and could feel the timbers shifting, barely gripped by the wet and rusted nails. A large, flat expanse of rock made a landing before the next flight of steps began at its far end. She walked across the rock, feeling more secure. The next steps looked drier, but groaned when her feet came down on them. The rough-hewn stair stringers wiggled, but the rickety frame held. She came to the next landing, which was just a few planks attached to an old beam bolted to another rock. It was too narrow to be safe, she thought, especially for a little girl, and she stepped quickly up to it and off again. And after a few more nervous steps, she seemed so high now. She was standing on one end of the porch. The ugly seabird stared at her, its neck bent awkwardly. It was just a strange and heavy twist of driftwood. She now saw someone had apparently treasured enough to risk a dangerous haul up here for display. She walked slowly over to the window. The girl's face looked up at her, then vanished into the grubby darkness of the room, but not before Lauren had been struck by the remarkable family resemblance to Karen, to their mother, and to Lauren herself. She went to the heavily weathered door and knocked, waited, and knocked again. She tried the greenish knob, and after the momentary resistance of swollen wood, the door popped open. It took a while for her eyes to adjust, and when they did, she was disappointed by the dust-furred interior, the ridges of grime on the floor, the dirty bottles and corroded pans, the water stains on the walls as large and complex as a duotone landscape, the stench of mold. Her tears welled up. She hadn't realized just how much she'd hoped. When the ocean hissed behind her as the dying waves raced over the pebbled shore, and Karen drifted in and wrapped her arms around her, whispering "sis," and folding her seemingly weightless body into Lauren's embrace. They held each other and cried, and over Karen's shoulder, Lauren watched as that lovely little girl came in and smiled, holding up a lantern, and in that warmer light, she could see how mistaken she had been. The room was poor, but clean, and invited her with its array of quilts and pillows and cushioned chairs, handcrafts hanging on the walls, and everywhere she looked, an array of colors and intriguing shapes. The decay and disorder had been a product of the shadows, she thought, and the angle of the light, aided by her distress and fatigue.
Oh, thank you for that reading. I know it's just an excerpt from the story. I was revisiting it before tonight, and I was just thinking about what you said about ghost stories and absences, and it's such a unique haunted house in that story. Uses setting so well. It made me think of perhaps maybe even the opposite of absences going on, of like the absences, and even though the story is so much about longing and is so much about a very specific absence, about how it's like a shadowy mirror of how those absences get filled or how they want to be filled. What were some of the inspirations for the setting and for that particular ghost, Steve?
Well, Melanie and I were in England, and we had a B&B, third floor in Hastings, on the beach or the shore there, and the window looked out on the ocean. And I never stayed somewhere so close to the ocean, and it just kind of struck me how high the horizon line was, as if I kept wondering, okay, I know that this is science, this is physics, and the ocean's not going to pour over me, but for just a moment, it seemed awfully threatening. And that's when the initial idea came. And for some reason, I kept thinking about time I'd spent in North Carolina and the beaches there and the hurricanes they'd had. And suddenly I had the three characters really, the woman who's looking for her sister, and the sister who's a little bit less than responsible, who's had a succession of poor choices in terms of men, and her young daughter. And the story pretty much wrote itself from there.
And a very, very unique visage of the ghost stuff, with the use of the seabird, and how at one point she sees the visage as the child and as herself and as the bird. I really like that. It was a very unique story. Before we talk about Wheatfield with Crows, one of the books of ghost stories that when we were preparing for the festival you mentioned to me was The Dangers of Smoking in Bed by Mariana Enriquez, which Wow, what a book! What a book that is too. Back when there's one of the stories back when we talked to the dead, which is amazing. I know she's writing from Buenos Aires, yet that story was one that was about just like 5 teenagers, and there's heavy metal, and there's smoking, and they're playing with the Ouija board, and it's amazing how that one captures that all too familiar something all too familiar about ghost stories. Yet it's also juxtaposed with the first story in that collection, Angelita Unearthed, which I found a very that's the one with the bones of the baby that was buried in the front yard.
Yeah.
What were some of the standout, or what is it about Enriquez's ghosts that stood out to you, Steve?
Well, it was a wonderful collection, and it's a really gritty, real collection. She grew up in Argentina during the time of the disappearances, when the dictatorship was getting rid of the leftists. And so massive numbers of people disappeared from Argentina. And the other thing that works into her stories is the fact that you have a lot of street kids in Buenos Aires and other parts of Argentina. And there's also a high disappearance rate among those children. And those very real facts haunt this entire collection. I think informs the way you see the ghosts. Her ghosts are, well, they're not ethereal at all. They're very realistic and palpable. And in some ways, they feel like a variety of the zombie motif. And they're so right there, and I think in part because they keep their distance, you're still able to see them as ghosts. It reminded me a bit of a Canadian film I saw a couple of years ago, Ghost Town Anthology, and that's about a ghost which haunts a small town which is failing, and the ghosts there are very realistic, are just seen in the distance as people who have died, and suddenly people start seeing them everywhere. And her collection is much the same way. She has a story in there called Kids Who Come Back. It's just an amazing piece about children who have disappeared from the streets, but suddenly they start coming back, but their relatives and their parents say that they're not really them. They don't know who they are, and so suddenly you have this city where all these children who disappeared are there, but no one really wants to own them, and no one really knows how to deal with them.
Wow. Yeah, and you mentioned how our ghosts almost appear. They keep their distance, and they appear, and they're very gritty, and it conjured the image of the ghost in Angelita Unearthed. The ghost is supposed to be this little angelic ghost baby, and there's so much angelic, cherubic imagery when the aunt is telling her about it. But when the ghost appears, it's not angelic at all. It's just a rotted out, decomposed ghost baby, and it's just literally following the narrator, and just that imagery itself, not even getting into the twists of the story, is so powerful.
And these aren't your charming Victorian ghosts here.
Yes, these are not formal, no formal wear to be found. At risk of reading even more from you, this is really short. In revisiting your book Here with the Shadows, which if you could hold up for everyone again, it's a fantastic collection. Here with the Shadows. I took a glimpse at the title story before tonight, and there's just this wonderful passage. I'm just going to read a couple of lines from it that really punctuates our conversation. It said, "It's just that there's this world full of people everywhere you look, leading their complicated lives because every life is more complicated than it looks. And then there is this world of those who have passed, not ghosts exactly, but their remembered presence. And those memories, well, they're everywhere. If you multiply that by this factor that all of us are things differently than people may remember, a person 100 different ways in 100 different places, then it's just staggering." That was one of the characters in the title story of that collection here with the Shadows, was explaining his notion of ghosts to the other character. The other story in that book that we're going to talk about tonight is Wheatfield with Crows. Now that shares a title. Does that share an actual title with the Vincent van Gogh painting?
That's right.
How did
There are several with that theme from him.
Oh, several in the collection.
Well, no, there are several paintings that are Wheatfield with Crows. That's several varieties.
Oh, okay, right. Like Van Gogh did those. Okay, how did that inspire you to? How did it play a part in crafting the story?
Well, it was one of the stories that I wanted to write for this book. With the Shadows, what I wanted to do was to write a collection that was my version of the wonderful British ghost story collections of the early 20th century, by people like Burridge and Gray and William R. James, of course, and those writers. And I love those, and I collected those. And Swan River Press had was publishing similar kinds of collections, and so this entire book was written for that press and for the purpose of doing my own version. And so when I was thinking about ideas, I'm often influenced by artists, and the Wheatfield with Crows always impressed me because the way that the wheat is portrayed and the way the crows come out of the wheat, like these dark rips in the sky. And so to me, it was an obvious influence. And in preparing for the story, I actually went to a small semi-ghost town north of Denver, which is mostly abandoned. The buildings are still there, although there are a few people who live there. And it's mostly a few falling down buildings surrounded by fields of wheat. And I just kind of sat there in my car for about an hour or two, listening to the wheat and looking at the wheat and taking notes. And the story pretty much came out of all that, those observations.
Well, yeah, you did an amazing job of capturing the Van Gogh aspect and the crows and the fields. But yeah, and so much more about that story, like the take on a ghost town, which has a very specific meaning in Americana, and just the feelings of lack of closure and a real range of emotions in that story I found too. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Steve. You're going to read a little bit from Wheatfield with Crows.
Yeah, I'm going to read a little bit from the opening. I will say my biggest debate on reading the story was how to pronounce Van Gogh. Van Gogh's the American pronunciation. The British pronounce his name Van Gogh, but in the original Dutch, G's are silent, so it's more like Van Gogh. But I think if you say Van Gogh, Americans will have no idea who you're talking about. So we'll have to deal with Van Gogh, I guess. Is the
author's choice, but I would enjoy all three.
Wheatfield with Crows. Sometimes when he sketched out what he remembered of that place, new revelations appeared in the shading, or displayed between the layering of a series of lines, or implied in a shape suddenly suggested in some darker spot in the drawing. The back of her head, or some bit of her face, dead or merely sleeping. He could never quite tell. He was no Van Gogh, but Dan's art still told him things about how he felt and what he saw, and he'd always sensed that if he could just find her eyes among those lines, or perhaps even in an accidental smear, he might better understand what happened to her. In this eastern part of the state, the air was still, clear and empty. An overabundance of sky spilled out in all directions with nothing to stop it, the wheat field stirring impatiently below. Driving up from Denver, seeing these fields again from such a distance, Dan thought the wheat appeared nothing special. He made himself think of bread and the golden energy that fed thousands of years of human evolution, but the actual presence of the grain was drab, if overwhelming. When he'd been here as a child, he thought these merely fields full of weeds, but so tall, they had been pretty much all he could see. A sea of weeds, wild and uncontrolled. But when he was a child, everything was like that, so limitless, so hard to understand. In the decade and a half since his sister's disappearance, Dan had been back to this tiny no place by the highway only once, when at 15, he'd stolen a car to get here. He'd never done anything like that before, and he wasn't sure the trip had accomplished anything. He just felt the need to be here, to try and understand why he no longer had a sister. But although the wheat had moved and shuddered and acted as if it might lift off the ground to reveal its secrets, it did not, and Dan had returned home. Certainly this trip, driving the hour from Denver, legally this time, with his mother in the passenger seat staring catatonically out the window, was unlikely to change anything in their lives. She'd merely said 2 words since he picked her up at her apartment. He'd had to give her some credit, though. She had a job now and no terrible boyfriends in her life, as far as he knew, but it was hard to be generous. Rogan, Colorado, near Interstate 76 and Colorado Road 73, lay at the heart of the state's grain crop. Main Street was a dirt road that ran alongside a railroad track. A few empty storefronts leaned attentively, but appeared to have nothing to say. The same abandoned house, he remembered, puffed out its gray streaked cheeks as it continued its slow motion collapse. The derelict Prairie Lodge Motel sat near the middle of the town, its doors wide open, various pieces of worn, overstuffed furniture dragged out for absent observers to sit and watch. Every few months, when Dan did an interior internet search, it came up as a ghost town. He wondered how the people who still lived here, and there were a few of them, tucked away on distant farms or hiding in houses behind closed blinds, felt about that. There's where it happened, his mother whispered, tapping the glass gently, as if hesitant to disturb him. That's where my baby disappeared.
Okay. Just cutting it there, reading a little bit from the entry, the beginning of Wheatfield with Crows, and that can be found in Here with the Shadows. So let's take a quick break. So just step away for a minute or two, 5 minutes, just to stretch our legs, grab a drink, perhaps. You could check out on the Facebook page where you can connect with all of tonight's authors and pick up their books of stories. And we'll come back for the second part of the show, and we'll be hearing from Gwendolyn and Jon. So we'll all be right back, if anyone's going to step away from the camera like me. Be right back. So I'm back in front of the camera, waiting for our guests to join us again. Thanks to everyone. I'm just checking out the comments. Thanks to everyone for coming. Oh, Gwendolyn, I can't seem to unmute your mic. I think maybe you have it on your end muted. Ah, there you go.
Oh, yeah.
I was just thanking everyone in the comments, our friends and colleagues, and saying hello and saying how much they've been enjoying the readings and they've been enjoying your stories. I don't think the guests can see the comments, so just know that there are. It's people have been enjoying it and saying thanks, and they've been enjoying all the readings there. So before we get started, welcome to the second half of tonight's Ghost Stories. It's a 5-night festival. Feel free to subscribe to the YouTube channel or stay in touch the way you stay in touch. Please be sure to check out on Facebook the ways you can stay in touch with our guests tonight and pick up their books of ghost stories. And before we dive into the second hour, I just want to mention the most recent works by our guests. Steve Rasnic Tem's new collection, Thana Trauma, Stories from Valancourt Books, Publishers Weekly. Starred Review says, World Fantasy Award winner Tim is at his sharpest and most crushing in this collection. It's essential for fans of dark, speculative fiction. And Venita Coehlo's most recent book of ghost stories, is Dark Tales, a collection of contemporary ghost stories. Gwendolyn Kiste's upcoming novel, Reluctant Immortals, is out in August 2022 from Saga Press, and it can be pre-ordered now. And Jon Padgett's book of stories is The Secret of Ventriloquism, and he's also the publisher and editor of Vesterian Magazine, and also Grimscribe Press. John, you had I didn't get a chance to put it in my notes, but you mentioned you've got a couple of if you could hold up, you've got some exciting upcoming and current releases from Grimscribe you wanted to mention.
Yeah, so we've got a brand new issue coming out, another double issue, which is coming out any day now. We're just waiting for the proof approval, and that is going to be fantastic. I think it's definitely one of the best that we've published so far, and also a work that is coming out very shortly from Grimscribe is Kurt Fawver's most recent collection, We Are Happy, We Are Doomed. I think I've got a copy.
Oh, John, can you hear us, John? You froze just getting.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay.
Here we
You're
go.
looking for
Sorry
looking for
about
a
that.
copy of it. No problem. Gorgeous cover. Gorgeous cover.
Yeah, this is the limited edition with internal and cover art by Harry O. Morris, a living legend in the world of the weird.
So, speaking of Visterion magazine, one of the stories that when we were talking about ghost stories that you mentioned to me was one that you published earlier this year. I think it was I'm always confused with numbers, volume 4, issue 1, but You Eat What You Are by Christina Ladd. And let's start off our portion with you. Want to launch right into a reading of selection from that story?
Yes, I wanted to show you from Visterion. That's art by Daniel.
Yeah, let's do it one more time. It was a little blurry. Put it one more time and then hold it still. So
Yeah, hold on. It's just not focusing.
Yeah, the camera doesn't want to focus on it, but yeah, it's gorgeous art.
Yeah,
Great job by making good, not only great books but good looking books too.
Thank you. Okay, so this is as Daniel said, You Eat What You Are by Christina Ladd, and I'm just going to read the first 5 minutes or so of it and leave the rest for you. Visterion, I should say, along with paper copies, we sell electronic copies in Kindle and EPUB at Pay What You Can. You can pay anything from 1 cent and up. Anything that you can for quite a terrific assortment of fiction, nonfiction, poetry, art, and hybrid pieces. So, You Eat What You Are by Christina Ladd. Midori Kawabata had one goal in life, and that was to become a ghost. In principle, this was simple. In practice, though, she was averse to dying. If she'd had any friends, and if those friends supported such a shocking goal, they would have scoffed at her lackluster commitment. What's so hard about offing yourself, one might ask? Don't you have any willpower at all, another might observe? These hypothetical friends all sounded like her mother, of course. Her mother's death of itself had not caused her spectral obsession. Certainly it had hurt. Nothing could compare to that pain, a bleeding gash that could never be sewn up. But it was not pain that drew her toward death. Ghosts, after all, were not said to be free of pain. Midori's mother had died in a car accident, swiftly and unattractively. Her pain had been intense but brief. She had never had the chance to waste away from cancer, which had been her greatest desire. She had spoken often and at length about this to Midori, despite Midori's protests. And you would care for me, wouldn't you, my favorite daughter? So selfless, so skinny, she laughed. And instead of taking her hand, she took Midori's wrist between her thumb and forefinger. Then she measured her own wrist in the same way. Midori did not particularly care about being skinny and certainly did not want to take any of the measures her mother took in order to remain so. Once, when Midori was in college, she had come down with terrible stomach pain. An entire day and night of vomiting brought no relief, but she was too weak to go to the hospital. All she could manage was to call home. Her mother had rushed to her side, and for a moment she knew what it was like to be cared for as a child. But then her mother leaned in close to her face and deeply breathed in, "I want to catch what you have. It's good for losing weight." What would have happened when her mother was no longer losing weight, but had lost it. Midori supposed that wouldn't have been until the scale read 0, that perfect curve of a number, the only roundness her mother would then possess. She would have been weightless. Midori did not particularly care about skinny or fat, but the idea of weightlessness was appealing. To float, to drift, to be above the ground like a ghost. A ghost. She would be able to touch the world and feel it run through her fingers. The idea sank deeper and deeper into her mind until she felt permeated by it. Thus began her singular obsession, even if she could not at first think of a way to fulfill it. Her mother had been fond of the English saying, "You are what you eat." In fact, she was more than fond of it. She treated it as a sacred principle. She ate only foods that were very skinny or very pale or both. White asparagus and vermicelli in clear broth was her favorite. Despite herself, Midori had adopted this philosophy as well. It was more aspirational for her, however, as she did her best to consume nothing but cigarettes. That was the kind of ghost she wanted to be. Little more than twisting, scented smoke. She wished that she could subsist on smoke alone. But just as she lacked the resolve to commit suicide quickly, she also could not bring herself to truly starve to death. If she couldn't muster the energy for a swift slash across her wrist, how could she ever find the resolve to refuse food and drink day after day? The pain frightened her, and the effort intimidated her. No, she could not approach death directly. She could only manage to do things that were harmful but not obviously deadly, so she wouldn't have to think about death. Smoking was the most obvious. Statistically, she was shortening her life by many decades, but the possibility existed that she would be one of those rare people who lived to 103 with the lung capacity of a free diver. So smoking alone was not enough. Food, cheap processed food, was another method. When she absolutely had to eat, she only nibbled on the worst possible snacks. Concealed within those shiny, crinkly little bags and boxes was a delectable irony. She would ostensibly feed her body while simultaneously damaging it with too much salt and sugar and fat. This food, too, was insubstantial. And that's all I'll read of that.
Mm. Oh, Jon, you're back. You were. We had some freeze frames of you in some of your poses there, but
Oops.
Yeah. So we can read the rest of that Christina Ladd story in Visterion Volume 4, Issue 1. Thank you for that reading.
Yeah, and the story gets better and better from there. And has a very unexpected and unusual twist.
I'm hooked already. I'm hooked, and I'm reconsidering my food choices already. But another Vesterian's a great looking book. I'm going to hold up this book. Let's see if the camera wants to focus on it. This is from another great small press publisher who does good looking books, Nightscape Press. This one's Ashes and Entropy. Jon, you have a story before we talk about some of your other favorites and my favorite ghost stories. You've written a story called Yellow House that appeared in here, and I love it how there's a synchronicity of how all these stories, at least I'm seeing thematic connections between all of them, how that story seems to be fitting in with our discussion and our examination of what makes a ghost or a ghost story, even though it's a haunted house story of sorts. Your story is a great blend of the psychological and paranormal, or possibly not even the paranormal. What can you tell us about Yellow House? Like when you write?
Well, Yellow House is, in a lot of the stories that I've written, the specter of my grandmother's house, my maternal grandmother who died at the age of 96 just a few months ago, and unfortunately died of over the course of years of severe dementia. And I was very close with her, extremely so, throughout my childhood and adulthood. And her house is the most common setting of my dreams, and has been for decades.
Wow.
I dream about it, I would say multiple times a week that I can remember. So this was my story, containing some of that place haunting a character. In this case, a character who may or may not be alive themselves. So it's kind of a story of ghosts haunting each other in some ways.
Yeah, I revisited it before tonight, and it really is a haunting story. I also want to say again my condolences on your loss. I know how that can be. Just hearing you speak about it tonight is inspiring me to be brave. I don't really talk too much about the personal inspirations behind my stories, but I dream, and for decades have dreamed about my grandmother's house as well. I was just a little shocked to hear that. Wow, I'm not like the only person that does that. And
Wow.
Yeah, like not only do I dream about the house, and it was a house that I grew up in, and just a house that was related to my family, and I dream about extra dimensional spaces that aren't in the house, like in the dream. I guess we're moving more into dreams than from ghost stories, but maybe there's something about the way that we process loss, and something about the way we think about our elders.
Yeah, there's definitely a relation there. I mean, we in dreams you can visit with loved ones who have passed on. In dreams, ghosts can absolutely be real in every sense.
And it's such a simple thing. Maybe it's an overlooked thing. It's such a simple thing that stories do, even when we're not thinking about them, is that maybe it's such a basic thing that I overlook it. But stories can preserve that which we can no longer go back to. Maybe it's not only just ghost stories, but all the stories. I think that's why I love stories with setting so much, even into places in personal history like that, looking at it from the author's side. The next story I wanted to talk to you about is a Thomas Ligotti story, and I came across this. I'm a newcomer to Thomas Ligotti. I probably mentioned this before. Learning about your work, Jon, has been what has been the gateway to Thomas Ligotti for me as a reader. And in preparing for the festival, I came across an article Matt Cardin wrote. I believe that the date on this is June of this year.
Mm-hmm.
And it's called The Best Thomas Ligotti Story You've Probably, in parentheses, Never Read. And it's called Ghost Stories for the Dead by Thomas Ligotti. And the brief introduction that I'll give to it is it's an uncollected story, and it tended to be in Matt's brief article, he mentioned it as being even on the more philosophical side, even for a Thomas Ligotti story. Did you want to say a little bit about setting it up and read
Absolutely.
from it?
Yeah, there are certain of Tom's work that are experimental pieces and more vignettes. and in some of these, and this is definitely not an exception, the horrific, as Matt puts it, the horrific philosophical speculations are foregrounded, and the actual story or plot becomes background or even somewhat subliminal. So it's definitely stretching what the ghost story is and can be to a limit for the reader, which I think is one of the things that has always appealed to me about Tom's work, is how distinctly voiced it all is. So the author or the author's consciousness is almost always involved in whatever story he's writing, whether experimental or not, or quite conventional. And this is no exception.
So what is there any setup you need to give us for the little excerpt you're going to read from?
Yeah, so I'm probably, it's quite a short piece, so I'm not going to read all of it. It's broken up into four parts. The first is called The New Blackness. The second is The New Silence. The third is The Old Nonsense and the New. And the fourth and last is called Tales of the New Dream. So I am going to read the last couple of sections, beginning with The Old Nonsense and the New.
Okay, over to Jon.
The Old Nonsense and the New. How serious was the old nonsense? How terrible was it? How sad? These seem ridiculous questions now, but at the time never are. For at just the right moment, they can seize the brain and squeeze it like something gone soft in the sun. And even when the sun is at its height, night may fall. Even when golden light leans over a nice, clean city. Indeed, from the lofty vantage of a 43rd floor, everything looks especially polished, sterling streets, dazzling semi-precious sidewalks, windows locked diamond-wise into the other big buildings spreading out there for miles. What a promising place this is. Here, everything is possible and nothing otherwise. No likelihood not leading to success, no unlikelihood linked to catastrophe, even for the newest comer loitering 23 stories above Terra Incognitaville. Terra Incognitaville. That's a word I've never said before. And though this hallway is long and quiet and empty, there is still no loneliness. There, look behind. A door is opening. The one leading to that supply room. Turn around. The man sneaking out of that room doesn't appear as if he has any business being up here. Then again, maybe he too is simply intent on staring out the window and dreaming about the future. But he walks right past the window and in passing sends someone crashing through it with just one good shove of the shoulder. 43 floors is a long way to fall. And in those last screaming moments, someone wonders how anyone could be duped by all this ludicrous glitter. How anyone could bear confronting the face of a world that writhes in darkness without for a moment relaxing its blinding and inexcusable smile. How easily the old nonsense leads us on, and with neither warning nor answers delivers us into a nonsense that seems so different, so new. For the new nonsense promises no punchlines or apologies, and the new nonsense peels itself back to reveal nothing within. No one is even left to know that nothing is there. How did you manage to take leave of that twinkling city without going any place? After you finished falling, where did you land? Where are you now? Where did you go? I am glad your responses do not make sense in those dreams I have of you. Tales of the New Dream. In the new dream, the dead may not rest very long. Sometimes their rightful blackness is revoked, deserved silence foreclosed, their blissful sense of nothing cut off at closing time. And now these faithful patrons of annihilation, loyal customers of the abyss, these quiet tenants of paradise, are thrown out on their ear like low-life riffraff booted from a respectable establishment. Back down to earth, you wretches. Having no place else to spend eternity, they try to make the best, in other words, the worst of it. Even now, Mr. Benedict Griggs, founding member of the Congenial Gents, holds the attention of his fellow clubmen, including the Reverend Penny, with a hair-raising anecdote from his visit to America. How he wandered, quite without intention, into that slatternly district of a large New England city where the notorious sad scientist murders had occurred, and how this drunkard, a somewhat lengthy knife in hand, weaved up to him to ask assistance and a few helpful directions home. Home, home, help me home, was all the wobbling souse said. And upon noticing that this weaver and wobbler had in fact no eyes in his head, Mr. Griggs credited the spectre with thereupon vanishing before his own. The entire episode merely put quite a scare into the rather fortunate Griggs, for others, depend on it, will have much more put into them. Others may not be able to tell their friends, as just have Jamie Lempkovich and his girl Lisa Ann Neff, that they were only grabbed by a pair of foul maniacs, one male and one female, who emerged from the sod in New Bernstyle Park as if from the gentle surface of a pond. Others may have to leave behind more than their shoes and an old blanket when they make a getaway from these ravenous revenants, assuming anyone at all gets away next time the hideous couple appear. Others may not be as lucky. And parallel to the small-town fame of the New Bernstyle Park haunting are those metropolitan legends currently circulating about an urban apparition that flies into its victim's face, though only on the darkest downtown nights. And if this skydiving shade finds a face it likes, in other words, hates, it just may decide not to fly out again. For in the new dream, such beings, wrenched from eternity and returned to earth, are capable of anything from indiscretion to atrocity. Those who have suffered most know how to inflict it best. It's a law of the universe. The suicides, the murdered, the unfulfilled, the broken-hearted, veterans of extraordinary suffering and mercenaries of its perpetuation. These are my mind's eyes, I who have no eyes. These are my mind's mind, I who am not mind. I am bereft of traits, bankrupt of qualities. The riches of the dead are extravagant next to my destitute nothingness. I have nothing but my immortality, and now, desiring or not, they will have it too. And I am glad I cannot know them. But I am even gladder they cannot know me.
Thank you, Don. I'm able to put some of the comments from, I figured it out here. So we've got lots of praise there. So we heard it from Amelia first. Maybe a weird dream series that should come.
That would be awesome. Thank you.
People are sending their condolences. People are, hey, we're not alone in stories about houses. So before we move on to the next portions, again, Yellow House can be found in Ashes and Entropy. You could read the story about the house that I dreamed about is in a book called The Night Marchers and Other Strange Tales. I have the article printed here on the story that Jon just read from Thomas Ligotti. I recommend Googling the article by Matt Cardin because it links to the original appearances, but it also links to where you could purchase a PDF of the story that Jon just read from.
Yeah, it originally appeared in Crypt of Cthulhu.
Okay, yeah, Crypt of Cthulhu, and I think you could get a PDF of it in Necronomicon Press. So thank you for that reading, Jon.
Thank you.
And our next, it was a pleasure, and the chat the chat is filled with people who really enjoy your readings as well, as much as we did. I just want to welcome back to the festival now, Gwendolyn Kiste. Thank you for coming back, Gwendolyn. How are you? Let's just do a sound check. Can I hear you?
Yeah, I can hear you. I can hear you.
Okay,
Thank you
great.
so much
It's
for
been the
having
night. Thanks for being here. It's the night of ghostly technology. But flashing back briefly to last year, you were in the first Ghost Story Festival we had, and we had a chance to talk about two of your books of ghost stories, which I'm a big fan of, The Invention of Ghosts and Pretty Mary's All in a Row. So those are posted. That's up. If anyone wants to tune in to last year, same YouTube channel. You can hear Gwendolyn. You can hear us talk about those books and even hear Gwendolyn read from them as well. And many of the authors in our preparations for this year's festival, those names came up. I thought you'd want to know those names came up as people's books they wanted to mention quite a bit. So that's it's nice to hear. But you've also written some stories. Two of I think these are two recent stories. The ghost stories Lost Girls Don't Cry.
Yes.
And Haunted Houses She Calls Her Own. Now, Lost Girls Don't Cry, is that in a book called Places We Fear to Tread?
Yes, from Cemetery Gates.
And what was that?
From Cemetery Gates Media, I believe. Yeah.
Okay, and the other one is Haunted Houses She Calls Her Own from an anthology called Liminal Spaces. I think.
Yes.
Is that Cemetery Gates Media as well, if I'm not mistaken?
I think so, yeah, I think that's both of them. I can't remember anything because of the pandemic, so that's why I'm like, I don't remember. Like, I don't know what day it is, what year it is. I barely know who I am, so that's why I'm like, I believe that's who it is.
I have pandemic memory on top of just I'm getting old memory there. So right there with you. But yeah, I wanted to. I certainly don't want to put you on the spot because you've already chosen a story that you're going to read from. I'm going to ask you about those stories, and if you want to just be completely spontaneous and read from one of those two, just want to put that out there to think about if you wanted to do that. But to start off with, I'm dying to hear about. Tell us about Lost Girls Don't Cry.
So yeah, that is a story about. They're kind of ghostly, but they're almost kind of not. They're this kind of like, again, that liminal area of sort of being alive and not being alive at the same time, of this group of girls that I have a lot of stories with groups of ghostly or like ethereal girls. Like I'm literally working on a story now with a group of ethereal girls doing weird ethereal things. And so this is another one of those stories, and it's at like a crybaby bridge. And there's like a lot of crybaby bridges in the area where I grew up. And so just these places where you supposedly can hear these babies crying, like that from where women threw their babies into the water. And so that's what it's kind of based on, is all these legends from, I grew up in Ohio, and there's a lot of legends in Ohio specifically, like everybody's got a crybaby bridge, I guess. And so that's, so that's like kind of the nugget, the initial kernel of inspiration for that one.
That is a spooky bit of urban folklore, if I've ever heard it, right there.
Yeah, and I don't think there's crybaby bridges everywhere, but like I looked them up, there are a decent number like scattered across the US, but it's a strange like little piece of Americana, I guess. I don't know if they have them elsewhere, but I know they have them in America.
Wow. And what about haunted houses she calls her own from Liminal Spaces? What's that one about?
Yeah, that is actually based on the Black Dahlia and the ghost of
Oh,
Black
okay.
Dahlia, and actually has it so she is being haunted by the different versions of what people think happened to her. So she's constantly having to live through the different theories that people have as to how she died. And she's sort of trying to escape that loop of what people have sort of condemned her to. I
Okay,
love
that's
like I love Americana in general, all the creepy things about America because it's got so many creepy, weird things, and that's definitely Hollywood has a lot of strange, ghost stories and things. So I think like the Black Dahlia is like one of the ones that I've always
yeah.
been very sad and always got
If I'm
under my
feeling brave, I might look up to see if there's any crybaby bridges around me. Now I want to know and I don't want to know both at the same time. Maybe when it's not December, I'm going to look that up. But speaking of looking and not looking at things, you're the person that one of the things I wanted to do more of this festival was talk about ghost stories on film, and I know you are an avid film watcher. What are some ghost stories on film that have your attention? Either some of your favorites or some of your recents.
I don't know. Now you're really putting
such
me
a
on the
tough
spot.
question there.
So ghost stories, like movies that are ghost stories, or stories about ghosts in movies.
Either or. I'll start off with one that came to my mind from some of your Facebook posts. I know earlier, and now this could be last year or it could be this year because we're on pandemic time. I know you were watching the 1950s iteration of the movie Cat People, and that you went on to watch the sequel, which was kind of not a sequel, The Curse of the Cat People, which is, it's not a sequel, but it's a ghost story. I mean, it is, but it's, yeah.
Yeah, it is. It both is a sequel and both not a sequel. But yeah, like Cat People isn't necessarily like a ghost story, right? But Curse of the Cat People is. Yeah. And it's such a beautiful little ghost story because it's creepy and it's got these really weird moments, but at the same time, it's also about childhood and about trying to get through how scary childhood can be. Because I feel like when you're a kid, everybody acts like, oh, it's the best years of your life. You're a little kid. It's great. And you're terrified the whole time because nothing makes sense and everything's really big and everything's confusing. And I love that because I don't think a lot of movies deal with that, but I felt like Curse of the Cat People really explored that and using the ghost as like an imaginary friend almost, is trying to get her through this like really scary time.
Yeah. You mentioned, speaking of the horrors of childhood, you mentioned that one of your favorite ghost stories from when you were young was How Fear Departed from the Long Gallery by E.F. Benson, which is bringing a smile to your face. What was, and I think you're going to read a bit from it, what was the appeal of both that story to you and ghost stories to you as the young iteration of yourself?
My parents, like both my parents love horror. And so it was always like a really fun thing growing up. And I feel like How Fear Departed from the Long Gallery was one of the first ghost stories I remember my parents talking about when I was really little. And so I always think back on, especially this time of year, because I love the tradition of like ghost stories in December, because December is such a haunted month. It's dark all the time, at least here in America. And it's just a creepy time of year. And so I love ghost stories this time of year. So whenever you said we were doing this again this year, I'm like, I really was thinking about reading this last year. And so I'm like, I'm gonna read a little bit from it. And this story in particular, My parents and I both have like really strange senses of humor, and like this is a very dark story and it goes to very dark places, but it also has a lot of humor, so it's kind of macabre, but it's got some really great, funny moments in it. I feel like that's my family in a nutshell. I feel like more than anything else, that's my family. Like that we're creepy and we're weird, and it's kind of terrible sometimes, but like it's also really funny, and that's like so my family. And so when I think of this story, I'm always like, yep. That's totally my family. Not the family in this necessarily, though maybe that to some extent too.
I'm glad that you're mentioning it now. There's two things I want to say to you or ask you before we move on to your reading. The first is I'm so glad you're mentioning that point because we were on a panel earlier this year and I bit my tongue. That someone was talking about something that's both macabre and funny, and I think they were talking about Beetlejuice. And I think the host was like, "Oh, Beetlejuice isn't a horror movie," and I was like, "Oh, you're about to get blocked, host." That's I'm like, I was just like biting my tongue. I'm like, now's not the time to discuss the philosophy of horror on the show. But yeah, and I recognize the feeling because like I'm such a grump. Like I have to be dragged kicking and screaming to like mixing my peanut butter with my chocolate. Like I'm like, keep that humor out of my horror. But when I look back, like Shaun of the Dead and Beetlejuice and horror movies like that, I do have such a soft spot for them. As much as I demand my horror to be completely philosophical and serious, I also love the the other part. So I'm glad you mentioned that. And the other thing I wanted to mention to you before you read from E.F. Benson, I was reading I'm going to hold this book up here. It's called Glimpses of the Unknown, Lost Ghost Stories, and it's edited by Mike Ashley, who is an editor for the British Library Tales of the Weird. And if you haven't come across it, like I just came across it, it has a ghost story called The Woman in the Veil by E.F. Benson. And I guess apparently it's a previously uncollected E.F. Benson story. And he goes into... for each story that he collects, he goes into the history of it, which is kind of fun. But since you were reading an E.F. Benson story, I just wanted to mention that this might be on your E.F. Benson radar. But I'm going to turn it over to you, and you're going to read a bit from How Fear Departed from the Long Gallery.
All right. Church Peveril is a house so beset and frequented by specters, both visible and audible, that none of the family which it shelters under its acre and a half of green copper roofs takes psychical phenomenon with any seriousness. For to the Peverils, the appearance of a ghost is a matter of hardly greater significance than is the appearance of the post to those who live in more ordinary houses. It arrives, that is to say, practically every day. It knocks or makes other noises. It is observed coming up the drive or in other places. I myself, when staying there, have seen the present Mrs. Peveril, who is rather short-sighted, peer into the dusk while we were taking our coffee on the terrace after dinner and say to her daughter, "My dear, was that not the blue lady who has just gone into the shrubbery? I hope she won't frighten Flo. Whistle for Flo, dear." Flo, it may be remarked, is the youngest and most precious of many dachshunds. Blanche Peveril gave a cursory whistle and crunched the sugar left unmelted at the bottom of her coffee cup with her very white teeth. "Oh, darling, Flo isn't so silly as to mind," she said. "Poor blue Aunt Barbara is such a bore. Whenever I meet her, she always looks as if she wanted to speak to me, but when I say, 'What is it, Aunt Barbara?' she never utters, but only points somewhere towards the house, which is so vague. I believe there was something she wanted to confess about 200 years ago, but she has forgotten what it is." Here, Flo gave 2 or 3 short, pleased barks and came out of the shrubbery, wagging her tail and capering around what appeared to me to be a perfectly empty space on the lawn. "There, Flo has made friends with her," said Mrs. Peveril. "I wonder why she dresses in that very stupid shade of blue." From this it may be gathered that even with regard to psychical phenomenon, there is some truth in the proverb that speaks of familiarity. But the Peverils do not exactly treat their ghosts with contempt, since most of that delightful family never despised anybody, except such people as avowedly did not care for hunting or shooting or golf or skating. And as all of their ghosts are of their family, it seems reasonable to suppose that they are, even the poor blue lady, excelled at one time in field sports. So far, then, they harbor no such unkindness or contempt, but only pity. Of one Peveril, indeed, who broke his neck in vainly attempting to ride up the main staircase on a thoroughbred mare after some monstrous and violent deed in the back garden, they are very fond, and Blanche comes downstairs in the morning with an eye unusually bright when she can announce that Master Anthony was very loud last night. He, apart from the fact of having been so foul a ruffian, was a tremendous fellow across country, and they like these indications of the continuance of his superb vitality. In fact, it is supposed to be a compliment when you go to stay at Church Peveril to be assigned a bedroom which is frequented by defunct members of the family. It means that you are worthy to look on the august and villainous dead, and you might find yourself shown into some vaulted or tapestried chamber without benefit of electric light, and are told that great-great-grandmamma Bridget occasionally has vague business by the fireplace, but it is better not to talk to her, and that you will hear Master Anthony awfully well if he attempts the front staircase any time before morning. There you are left for your night's repose, and having quakingly undressed, begin reluctantly to put out your candles. It is draughty in these great chambers, and the solemn tapestry swings and bellows and subsides, and the firelight dances on the forms of huntsmen and warriors in stern pursuits. Then you climb into your bed, a bed so huge that you feel as if the desert of Sahara was spread for you, and pray, like the mariners who sailed with St. Paul, for day. And all the time, you are aware that Freddie and Harry and Blanche and possibly even Mrs. Peveril are quite capable of dressing up and making disquieting tappings outside your door, so that when you open it, some inconjecturable horror fronts you. For myself, I stick steadily to the assertion that I have an obscure valvular disease of the heart, and so sleep undisturbed in the new wing of the house, where Aunt Barbara and great-great-grandmamma Bridget and Master Anthony never penetrate. I forget the details of great-great-grandmamma Bridget, but she certainly cut the throat of some distant relation before she disemboweled herself with the axe that had been used at Agincourt. Before that, she had led a very sultry life, crammed with amazing incident. But there is one ghost at Church Peveril at which the family never laugh, in which they feel no friendly and amused interest, and of which they only speak just as much as is necessary for the safety of their guests. More properly, it should be described as two ghosts, for the haunt in question is that of two very young children who were twins. These, not without reason, the family take very seriously indeed. The story of them, as told me by Mrs. Peveril, is as follows. In the year 1602, the same being the last of Queen Elizabeth's reign, a certain Dick Peveril was greatly in favor at court. He was brother to Master Joseph Peveril, then owner of the family house of Lance, who 2 years previously, at the respectable age of 74, became father of twin boys, firstborn of his progeny. It is known that the royal and ancient virgin had said to the handsome Dick, who was nearly 40 years his brother's junior, "'Tis pity that you are not master of Church Peveril," and these words probably suggested to him a sinister design. Be that as it may, handsome Dick, who very adequately sustained the family reputation for wickedness, set off to ride down to Yorkshire, and found that very conveniently his brother Joseph had just been seized with an apoplexy, which appeared to be the result of a continued spell of hot weather combined with the necessity of quenching his thirst with an augmented amount of sack, and had actually died while handsome Dick, with God knows what thoughts in his mind, was journeying northwards. Thus it came about that he arrived at Church Peveril just in time for his brother's funeral. It was with great propriety that he attended the obsequies, and returned to spend a sympathetic day or two of mourning with his widowed sister-in-law, who was but a faint-hearted dame, little fit to be mated with such hawks as these. On the second night of his stay, he did that which the Peverils regret to this day. He entered the room where the twins slept with their nurse, and quietly strangled the latter as she slept. Then he took the twins and put them into the fire which warms the long gallery. The weather, which up to the day of Joseph's death had been so hot, had changed suddenly to bitter cold, and the fire was heaped high with burning logs and was exultant with flame. In the core of this conflagration he struck out a cremation chamber, and into that he threw the two children, stamping them down with his riding boots. They could just walk, but they could not walk out of that ardent place. It is said that he laughed as he added more logs. Thus he became master of Church Peveril. The crime was never brought home to him, but he lived no longer than a year in the enjoyment of his blood-stained inheritance. When he lay a-dying, he made his confession to the priest who attended him, but his spirit struggled forth from its fleshly coil before absolution could be given him. On that very night, There began in Church Peveril the haunting which to this day is but seldom spoken of by the family, and then only in low tones and with serious mien. For only an hour or two after Handsome Dick's death, one of the servants passing the door of the long gallery heard from within peals of the loud laughter, so jovial and yet so sinister, which he had thought would never be heard in the house again. In the moment of that cold courage which is so nearly akin to mortal terror, he opened the door and entered, expecting to see he knew not what manifestation of him who lay dead in the room below. Instead, he saw two little white-robed figures toddling towards him hand in hand across the moonlit floor. The watchers in the room below ran upstairs, startled by the crash of his fallen body, and found him lying in the grip of some dread convulsion. Just before morning, he regained consciousness and told his tale. Then, pointing with trembling and ash-gray finger toward the door, he screamed aloud, and so fell back dead. But don't worry, fear departs the long gallery before it's over. It lives up to its name. The ghosts, it has a happy ending. For all that, for all the horrors of the place, it does have a happy ending.
So thank you for that reading. And before we move on to our last question for the group, thank you also to all the wonderful readings by all of the guests tonight. The hour is getting late. I have so many more questions, but in recognition of the hour running late, I think I'm just going to try to smush them all into like one final question for the panel. One of the things that's on my mind to make sure we highlight this year's festival is talking about and highlighting our favorite ghost stories written by women, and we're off to a good start already, but I thought that would be a great final question for our panel. So we can go around and talk about some of our favorite, or just talk about which are our favorite ghost stories. Two names, I'll start it off, but two names that came up from this group and from the all of our panelists across the festival were Edith Wharton and Charlotte Perkins Gilman. So we can go around the panel and just mention some our feelings on those stories or our favorite ghost stories written by women. Since you just read Gwendolyn, any that spring to mind for you, or any thoughts on those stories?
I do love Edith Wharton and Charlotte Perkins Gilman. I'm a big fan. I wrote an article for Vastarian, actually, for John's awesome magazine about Charlotte Perkins Gilman. I love her work very much. I will always bring up Shirley Jackson. She's written some fabulous ghost stories. I feel like it almost goes without saying at this point. As for modern authors, A.C. Wise has written some really great ghost stories. She just had a recent collection. I just love some of her ghost stories. And Eden Royce has done some really great, like, Southern Gothic. So Eden and A.C. So Eden Royce and A.C. Wise have done some really great stuff just in the last few years. So.
All right, let's move the same question over to John. If you just tell us which Vastarian issue we can find that article and tell us.
Let me find it. Gwendolyn actually won one of her several, at least, Stoker Awards.
Oh wow!
For that.
Congratulations!
And it is excellent. That is in Vastarian Volume 2, Issue 1.
Okay, great.
And it's and the yellow wallpaper has always been one of my very favorites. I wanted to mention Angela Carter, who was really an extraordinary writer, who I'm currently absorbing right now.
Yeah.
She has more than a few revenants in her work. I really want to highlight the piece that I read from, one of the pieces by Christina Ladd, "You Eat What You Are," which is in Volume 4, Issue 1, and it's just fantastic. It's a really powerful story. It's funny, as you can see, but it's so much more, and it's unlike any ghost story I think I've ever read. And Halloo, as I mentioned before, by Gemma Files, is just amazing. There's actually another story that could be said to be a ghost story in that same collection called The Church in the Mountains, which is just seriously mind-blowing. It's just a remarkable story, and I love her work.
Over to Steve. Any of your favorite ghost stories written by women that you want to bring to our attention?
Linda Rucker.
Oh, okay.
I think she'd be much more famous than she is. I wrote the introduction to her first collection, which was published by Goose and Niblet Press, micro edition. And Undertow did a limited hardcover, but you can get The Moon Will Look Strange as an ebook very cheaply. Her second collection is You'll Know When You Get There. That's published by Swan River. The thing about Linda's work is, well, when I had heard her name, but I hadn't read many of the stories. But when I got the manuscript, I was pretty much astounded. Her stories read like really good literary, realistic fiction. But at a certain point, they transition into the numinous in a way that you can't always even tell how she did that. They're wonderful stories, and I think when I first encountered her work, it was much the same. I felt much the same way as when I first encountered Caitlin Kiernan. It just really blew me away. I thought, well, no one's writing this well, especially in this mode. I think Linda's the most Aikman-like writer that I can think of right now.
As if I weren't already raised, my book list wasn't getting any bigger. It sold on that for sure. Venita, any ghost stories by women that are some of your favorites or you want to let us know about?
I was trying so hard to think of a ghost story written by an Indian woman, and I couldn't. I could think of strings and strings of female ghosts, but I couldn't think of a Indian ghost story writer, and that's also because it's a very new genre for us. We've just started writing in this space. So yeah, my favorite is definitely Shirley Jackson. I mean, I love what she does. Just it also resonates with me because she does more than the ghost story. She does it's also commentary, it's so many things. So I would definitely say read her if you haven't done it so far. It's fabulous.
Well, that's why we're lucky to have you and your books of ghost stories that might be new to some of our listeners. And if you could, we started the night out by talking about some of those ghosts scribbled in your notebook. Any female ghosts scribbled in that notebook, or any ghosts that you want to end the night by telling us a little bit about a very specific Indian ghost, perhaps?
There are so many female ghosts. I guess, I think the powerless also end up being ghosts. Yes, thank you. I'm sorry.
No,
we have an addition to our panel.
So,
there's a delightful ghost in South India, and she's called Nalla Ba. And Nalla Ba basically means come back tomorrow. And apparently when she knocks on your door, you're supposed to shout Nalla Ba, and she's obviously a very silly ghost, but she turns around and goes away. So Nalla Ba.
A silly ghost and a very cute pup there, which I'd pay good money to have my cat perform like that, but she just can't be bothered. But that's a wonderful note to end the night on, hearing about that, the Nalla Ba, the ghost, which I'm going to be looking up. And it was a joy to see your pup, and it was a joy to hear all four of you read and to hear about some of your favorite ghost stories. So thank you to the panelists. Thank you to everyone in the comments, our friends and colleagues. I'm going to run the closing credits. So if the four panels would stick around so we could say goodbye after that video goes, and just to let you know that our friends and colleagues are as well. So on that note, here's our closing credits.